Uh, we're happy to have with us Swami Medhananda. He's just been transferred from India, and he is a scholarly monk of the Ramakrishna Order and senior research fellow in philosophy at the Vedanta Society of Southern California in Hollywood. He's a newly appointed religious director for the Hindu Students Organization at the University of Southern California. He's highly educated and speaks how many languages, Swami?
About 4 or 5.
4 or 5, okay. And he's was recently known to us because of his publications by the Oxford University Press, one big book on Ramakrishna and another on Vivekananda, and there is a third on the dialectics of aesthetic agency. So it's Swami is a real scholar, and I hope he's able to tone it down a little bit for us.
I'll try my best.
Okay, so we're happy to have with him. His topic is a tale of two Advaitas. Swami Medhananda.
Thank you so much. My pranams to Brahmaprana Mataji. Thank you to Lakshmi for helping on the technical side, and welcome everyone. Thank you all for attending. Let's begin maybe with the mantra. Om Sthapakaya cha dharmasya sarva dharma swarupini avatara varishtaya Ramakrishnaya te namaha. So I'll be speaking today on a tale of two Advaitas. I think last weekend, that Sarvapriyanandaji and Atmarupanandaji both conducted a workshop on Advaita Vedanta. Is that right, Mataji? And so I'm guessing that was from the standpoint of Shankara and his followers. So I thought I'd kind of give a different perspective. So typically when we hear the word Advaita, we think of Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, the great 8th century Advaita Vedantan. But there are many different kinds of Advaita philosophy. There are far more than 2. So I don't want you to be misled by my title. There aren't just 2 Advaitas. There are 4, 5, possibly 6 Advaitas, possibly more. But in the scope of one lecture, I wouldn't be able to cover that many forms of Advaita. So I wanted to stick to 2. So just to mention a few, for instance, Kashmiri Shaivism is a form of Advaita. So is Shuddha Advaita. So is Shaktism. These are all forms of Advaita. But today, I wanted to briefly contrast Shankara's Advaita Vedanta with the Advaita Vedanta of Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda. And I say contrast, but I don't want you to be misled by that word. It's not that they're completely different. I see the Advaita philosophy of Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda as encompassing Shankara's philosophy, but going beyond it because it's broader in certain respects. And I want to explain in what respects the Advaita philosophy of Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda is broader than Shankara's, and I think more relevant to today's world. So let's begin briefly. So what I'm going to do is talk briefly about Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, because I think most of you are going to be familiar with it in its broad outlines, and because Sarvapriyanandaji has hundreds of videos on Shankara's Advaita, so you can, and I'm sure many of you have watched many of them. So I don't want to bore you to death. So I want to focus, the brunt of this lecture is going to be on this new, broader form of Advaita Vedanta taught by Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda. But let's begin with Shankara's philosophy. According to Shankara, the only reality is the impersonal, non-dual Brahman, what he calls Nirvishesha or Nirguna Brahman. And everything else, including all individual souls, everything in this world, and Ishvara, meaning the personal God, according to Shankara, these have empirical reality. They're real from the empirical standpoint, from the Vyavaharika standpoint, but not real from the ultimate standpoint, from the Paramatika standpoint. So this is all Shankara 101. So I hope I'm not saying anything too controversial here. The famous formula that summarizes the main doctrine of Advaita, I'm sure most of you know this: Brahma Satyam, jagat mithya, jivo brahmeva na paraha. Non-dual pure consciousness alone is real. This entire world is ultimately non-existent. And the last phrase, jivo brahmeva na paraha, means I, in my truest essence, am none other than that non-dual pure consciousness. So in a nutshell, that's Advaita, but I wanted to just give you a couple textual references to make it a little bit more concrete here. So what does Shankara have to say about the personal God? A lot of people say he wrote wonderful bhakti hymns and this and that. First of all, we don't know that, because what happens in India is that if somebody becomes very famous as a saint or as a philosopher, they tend to ascribe all sorts of texts to that person, just as a kind of tradition, and because it lends prestige to the text. But it's not at all clear that he wrote texts like Bhaja Govindam and other things. Number two, even if he did, the difficulty is, if he was full of bhakti in those hymns, you still have the difficulty of trying to reconcile his bhakti in those hymns with his stance on bhakti and the personal God in his commentaries on the Vedantic scriptures, which we know to be his. So we're not out of the woods just by saying that he was a great bhakta. Why does he say the things he does in his commentaries on the Upanishads, Bhagavad Gita, and Brahma Sutra? Let me give you an example, just one example, because we have limited time. In his commentary on Brahma Sutra 2.1.14, Shankara explains the status of Ishvara, the personal God, as follows. I'll read it carefully because the language is a bit technical. He says, thus Ishvara meaning the personal God, thus Ishvara's rulership, omniscience, and omnipotence are dependent on the limiting adjuncts, meaning upadhis, conjured up by ignorance, avidya. But from the ultimate standpoint, from the Paramatika standpoint, such terms as the ruler, the ruled, omniscience, etc., cannot be used with regard to the Atman in its true nature after the removal of all limiting adjuncts through knowledge. Okay, this is a mouthful and it's a bit technical, but he's saying something fairly straightforward. What he's saying is that all of the attributes of the personal God that we're all familiar with, omniscience, omnipotence, and so on, rulership, the fact that there's a personal God who rules over this world, these are only true from the standpoint of ignorance. Ignorance of what? Of Brahman. And the moment we attain the knowledge of Brahman, all of these limiting adjuncts, which we ignorantly superimpose upon Brahman, vanish. And what's left? Our true nature, which is non-dual pure consciousness, which means that the personal God does not exist from the ultimate standpoint. So this is Shankara's view on the personal God. Now, second, what's his view on the status of this world of names and forms? According to Shankara, this entire world of names and forms, namarupa in Sanskrit, is, quote, conjured up by ignorance. It's one of his favorite phrases, which he uses all the time in his commentaries. Avidya kalpita, imagined or conjured up through ignorance. And he says that Brahman, in its ultimate nature, remains unchanged and beyond all empirical dealings. This is a direct quotation taken from his commentary on Brahma Sutra 2.1.27. So the view, in short, is Vivartavada. Vivartavada means that this world is an illusory appearance of Brahman. But in reality, Brahman never transforms into this world at all. There's no connection whatsoever between Brahman and the world, because all there is Brahman. There is no world. Only the substratum of this world is real. That substratum is Brahman, but names and forms are illusory. Shankara uses a very familiar analogy here to explain the relationship between Brahman and the world. Everybody here, I'm sure, is familiar with it. The rope and the snake. I'm walking along a road and I see something which looks like a snake. So I kind of, I wince and I run out of the way. And then my friend says, "Oh, what are you so scared about? It's not a snake, it's a rope." And then I look again and I say, "Oh, wait a minute, it was a rope all along. I mistook it for a snake." Shankara says exactly in the same way. There's nothing but Brahman, but out of ignorance, we mistakenly see Brahman as this illusory world of names and forms. In reality, there never was a world. There never was individual soul. There never was ignorance. There's just Brahman. And finally, before we move on to the second kind of Advaita that I wanted to focus on, what are Shankara's views on spiritual practice? Again, most of this should be quite familiar to you. One yoga, not surprisingly for Shankara, is superior to all the rest in leading directly to liberation. Obviously, it's Jnana Yoga, the yoga of knowledge. What is Jnana Yoga according to Shankara? Shravana, Manana, and Nididhyasana. Listen carefully to the teachings of a qualified Advaita Vedantic guru who teaches you a Mahavakya from the Upanishads. Tattvam Asi, thou art that Brahman, or Aham Brahmasmi, I am that Brahman, and so on. Then Manana, reflect deeply on that teaching with a pure mind. And then finally, Nididhyasana, try to internalize that teaching through deep meditation and further study of the scriptures. And ultimately, it should culminate in direct realization of your true nature as Brahman. This is Jnana Yoga. And what Shankara says is that other yogas are not completely useless, but they're stepping stones. They're preliminary disciplines for purifying the mind and thereby making you eligible to practice the higher practice of Jnana Yoga. What are these other yogas that he's talking about? In particular, Karma Yoga and Bhakti Yoga. He says that these are good. These are very, very good. Because to be eligible to practice Jnana Yoga is a very tall task. You have to be sadhana chatushtaya sampanna. You have to be equipped with the fourfold sadhana. Viveka, discrimination between what's real and what's unreal, what's permanent, what's impermanent. Vairagya, intense dispassion for any worldly pleasures and attachments. Shat Sampad, the six treasures. Shama Dhamma, which means control of the senses, and there are many other of these six virtues. And Mumukshutva, intense longing for liberation. And this is no joke. Having being equipped with this fourfold sadhana, these intense spiritual qualities is no joke. This is a journey of many lives. And so Shankara says, Karma Yoga and Bhakti Yoga are indispensable for acquiring the eligibility, that purity of mind, and that concentration of mind necessary to practice Jnana Yoga. But still, at the end of the day, he says that these are lower practices because they only make you eligible to practice Jnana Yoga. And ultimately, it's Jnana Yoga that takes you to the goal of life, which is knowledge of Brahman. So, in short, if we want to characterize the essence of Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, we might call it an exclusive Advaita Vedanta. Exclusive in the sense that it excludes everything but Brahman. It affirms the sole reality of non-dual pure consciousness, and it says that the individual souls, as individual souls, don't exist. They only exist as Brahman. The personal God as the personal God, meaning as a loving God who creates this universe and looks over us and responds to our prayers, does not exist. It only exists as the same Brahman. This world of names and forms does not exist as names and forms. It only exists as Brahman. So it excludes the world as we know it, it excludes the personal God as we know it, and it excludes individual souls as we know ourselves, right? Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya Jivo Brahmaiva Naparaha. Now, let's focus for the remainder of this lecture on the second kind of Advaita philosophy that I wanted to talk about. This is the Advaitic philosophy which I take to have been taught by Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda. There's a lot of controversy about what exactly Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda taught. And there are some monks and some scholars who claim that they taught nothing but Shankara's Advaita Vedanta. I respectfully differ from that view. And I've, in my books, in my articles, and in my lectures, I present an alternative interpretation. So that's what I'm going to explain today. So I call Sri Ramakrishna's Advaita philosophy Vijnana Vedanta. The reason being that he grounds his Advaitic philosophy in a special spiritual state, which he calls Vijnana. And in my new book on Swami Vivekananda's philosophy, I refer to Swami Vivekananda's philosophy as integral Advaita. And the term integral may not be familiar to some people unless you studied Aurobindo, for instance, but integral means all-encompassing, comprehensive. So the reason why I like the term integral is because it's a nice counterpoint to the exclusive Advaita of Shankara, right? This is an Advaita that encompasses everything. It's an all-encompassing oneness. Sri Ramakrishna used to say, Shob Jodiya Ekti in Bangla, which means it's a oneness that includes Jiva, Jagat, and Ishvara, all the individual souls, this entire world of names and forms, and the personal God. It doesn't exclude anything. So I'm going to come back to this, but I wanted to, some people like having like little sort of catchphrases, formulae. So I want to give you, I already gave you the succinct Sanskrit formula for Shankara's Advaita, Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya Jivo Brahma Vinaparaha. If we were to encapsulate the integral Advaita of Sri Ramakrishna and Swamiji, we might say Brahma Shakti Satyam Jagat Satyam. Notice I don't say Brahma Satyam, I say Brahma Shakti Satyam. Brahma hyphen Shakti, which means Brahman and Shakti are just different but equally real aspects of the same divine reality. They're both fully real. Brahma Shakti Satyam. Jagat Satyam. And the world is real as a manifestation of Shakti. Okay, so this is integral Advaita in a nutshell, but let's look at it a little bit more closely. First of all, I mentioned that this integral Advaita philosophy of Sri Ramakrishna and Swamiji was based on a special spiritual state which Sri Ramakrishna called Vijnana. What is Vijnana? Let me read you an important teaching of Sri Ramakrishna. This is from his Kathamrita, the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. He says, and he distinguishes jnana, the states of jnana and vijnana. So he says, the jnani, the knower of Brahman, gives up his identification with worldly things, discriminating not this, not this. Only then can he realize Brahman. It is like reaching the roof of a house by leaving the steps behind one by one. But the Vijnani, who is more intimately acquainted with Brahman, realizes something more. He realizes that the steps are made of the same materials as the roof, bricks, lime, and brick dust. That which is realized as Brahman through the eliminating process of not this, neti, neti, is then found to have become the universe and all its living beings. The Vijnani sees that the reality which is nirguna, meaning impersonal or without attributes, is also saguna, meaning with attributes or personal. A man cannot live on the roof for a long time. He comes down again. Those who realize Brahman in Samadhi come down also and find that it is Brahman that has become the universe and its living beings. This is known as Vijnana. So there's a lot here. This is a very philosophically packed passage. And for the remainder of the lecture, I want to kind of unpack what he's saying here. First, regarding the nature of ultimate reality, what does Sri Ramakrishna say from the standpoint of Vijnana? He says that, see, reaching the roof in this metaphor means you attain the knowledge of non-dual pure consciousness in the state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi. And then he says, most people within 21 days, they leave their physical body in that state. But there's a special class of jiva, of soul, which he calls Ishvara Kotis. And he defines Ishvara Koti very precisely as avataras, and he says avatar or avataret ongsho, which means incarnations of God or those who come as parts or portions of an incarnation. So these are a different category of soul altogether. They don't come to this earth because of their own prarabdha karma, their own karma. These are divinely commissioned souls. He says only they, after reaching the roof, after attaining the state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi, can come back down to the relative plane. And what do they see? They attain the state of what Sri Ramakrishna calls Vijnana. So they go beyond these knowers of Brahman. They have the knowledge of Brahman, non-dual pure consciousness. And then they come back and they see, wait a minute, that non-dual pure consciousness, which is my deepest essence, is one with Shakti, the personal God. And this world is not unreal. It's a real manifestation of Shakti. Everywhere I look, I see nothing but Shakti in different forms. This is the Vijnani's realization. Sri Ramakrishna, from the standpoint of Vijnana, he used to teach Brahma Shakti Abhed. So non-dual pure consciousness, Nirguna Brahman, and Shakti, the personal God, are Abheda. Abheda here can be translated in different ways. Nikhilanandaji chooses to translate it most of the time as identical, and I think that's really problematic. Because I don't think it's identical, I think maybe inseparable would be better. The idea is that Brahman and Shakti are inseparable, but equally real aspects of the same divine reality. But the reason why they're not identical is because Brahman is the static or impersonal dimension of the divine reality, whereas Shakti is the dynamic aspect of the same reality. Sri Ramakrishna clarifies this teaching in another place in the gospel. He says, when I think of God as inactive or static, Niskriya is the original Bangla term, I call it Brahman. And when I think of that same God as creating, preserving, and destroying the universe, then I call it Shakti or Kali. যখন তিনি নিষ্ক্রিয় তখন আমি ব্রহ্ম বলে কই, যখন তিনি সৃষ্টিতে প্রলয় করছেন তখন আমি শক্তি বলে কই, কালী বলে কই. So it's the same God seen from different aspects or in different capacities. That's the idea. Brahman and Shakti are two sides of the same divine coin. And so, for instance, he likens the relationship of Brahman and Shakti with fire and its power to burn. Agni arta dahika shakti. And what's significant about this metaphor is that it's bidirectional. There's a mutual dependence. You cannot think of, and he says this explicitly, he says, you cannot think of fire without thinking of fire's power to burn. You cannot think of fire's power to burn without thinking of fire. So this is very different from Shankara's rope snake analogy. Let's come back to the rope snake. Can the rope exist apart from the snake? Yes, 100%. Can the snake exist apart from the rope? No. It's an asymmetrical dependence. It's an asymmetrical relation. Snake depends for its existence on rope, but rope does not depend for its existence on snake. But Sri Ramakrishna says, Brahman and Shakti are mutually implicating, mutually dependent. So it's ontologically very different from Shankara's understanding of the relationship between Brahman and this world. And I've been talking about Sri Ramakrishna's teachings, but what about Swami Vivekananda? Swami Vivekananda taught very much in the same way as Sri Ramakrishna. He would say, for instance, our religion preaches an impersonal, personal God. Impersonal, personal God. This is just an English translation of Brahma Shakti Abhay, or that reality which is Nirguna is also Saguna, as Sri Ramakrishna used to say. Now, another thing is, you might say, but wait a minute, but we know that Swami Vivekananda always taught Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, and he held that impersonality, the impersonal God, is higher than the personal God. I think that's right, that he does put impersonality above personality, but in a different sense than Shankara does. And that's what I want to bring your attention to. So let's look at this. There it goes. Okay. So let me read you a passage from the second lecture on practical Vedanta delivered in 1896. Swami Vivekananda says the following: the impersonal God is a living God, a principle. The difference between personal and impersonal is this, that the personal is only a man, and the impersonal idea is that he is the angel, the man, the animal, and yet something more which we cannot see, because impersonality includes all personalities, is the sum total of everything in the universe, and infinitely more besides. So I think this is really important. Look at Swami Vivekananda's definition of impersonality. He's making a radical claim here. Impersonality is higher than the personal because it's a greater generalization. The personal is limited to a particular personal form. Impersonality encompasses all personalities and is beyond personality. So he puts this in a formula. He says impersonality includes all personalities. Whereas according to Shankara, impersonality, Nirguna Brahman, excludes all personalities. We already saw that from the passage I read from his commentary on the Brahma Sutra with regard to the personal God. All the attributes of the personal God, all the different things that mark us out as individual souls are just limiting adjuncts, upadhis, ignorantly superimposed upon Brahman, according to Shankara. Swamiji says, no, these are all real as manifestations of God. And the impersonal in Swami Vivekananda's sense is all-encompassing. It includes personality, but goes beyond it. Now, second, regarding the status of this world, while Shankara held that this world is ultimately non-existent, the only truth is the substratum of the world, which is Brahman. Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda taught that the world of names and forms is a real manifestation of God. Sri Ramakrishna says it very explicitly in many places in the gospel. He says, as in the passage I already read you about Vijnani, he says the Vijnani sees that it is Brahman that has become the universe and its living beings. So everything you see in the world, every name and form, is nothing but a real manifestation of Shakti. And in the entry from the gospel dated 16th December 1883, one of Sri Ramakrishna's householder devotees named Mohima Chakraborty, he was a hardcore Shankarite. And so sometimes followers of Shankara, I find that the founders of a tradition tend to be less fanatical than their followers. And so that's certainly the case with Shankara, with Shankara's Advaita Vedanta. And so Mohima Chakraborty sort of had this idea that bhaktas are lower than Advaitins. And he kind of looked down on them. So he asked Sri Ramakrishna a question. He asked, do bhaktas also need ultimately to attain the state of Advaitic realization? And then Sri Ramakrishna says, absolutely not. That's not true. He says, in certain schools of bhakti, the goal is to remain in an eternal loving relationship with the personal God. He said there's such a thing as Nitya Krishna, Nitya Bhakta. The Bhakta is eternal, and God, the personal God, Krishna, is also eternal. And there's another passage. In this passage, M, the author of the Kathamrita, on 16th December 1883, he asked a very pointed question to Sri Ramakrishna. He asked, is the world unreal? Jagat ki mittha. And Sri Ramakrishna answers as follows. He says, why should the world be unreal? That is the way that Advaitic Jnanis reason. In the beginning, when a man reasons following the Advaita Vedantic method of neti, neti, not this, he realizes that Brahman is not the living beings, not the universe, not the 24 cosmic principles. All these things become like a dream to him. Then comes involution and evolution. Anuloma viloma is the original Bangla. And he feels that God himself has become the universe and all living beings. So I don't think Sri Ramakrishna could be any more explicit about this. He says that my ultimate teaching is from the standpoint of Vijnana, not Jnana. Jnanis dismiss this world as unreal, but I, as a Vijnani, am telling you, am explicitly affirming that this world is a fully real manifestation of God. Every name and form that we see is nothing but a different manifestation of Brahman. And Swami Vivekananda says exactly the same thing in a number of places. He doesn't use the term Vijnana very frequently, but the concept, the idea of Vijnana is omnipresent in his lectures, in his writings. So I wanted to give you just one example. He says, Swami Vivekananda says the following in his lecture, God in Everything. And notice even the title of the talk, God in Everything, that's also very Vijnana oriented. So Swami Vivekananda says, here I can only lay before you what the Vedanta seeks to teach. And that is the deification of the world. The Vedanta does not in reality denounce the world. The ideal of renunciation nowhere attains such a height as in the teachings of the Vedanta. But at the same time, dry suicidal advice is not intended. It really means deification of the world, giving up the world as we think of it, as we know it, as it appears to us, and to know what it really is, deify it. It is God alone. So it's clearly saying here that Vedanta, in its original teachings as found in the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita, never says the world is unreal. It says that the world itself is a manifestation of God. We're going to get to this at the end of our presentation if we have time. I wanted to, you might ask about, well, what do the Vedantic scriptures have to say about this? So I'm going to try to come to that if I have some time. But finally, well, not finally, there are two other issues I want to talk about. One is regarding spiritual practice. We've already seen that according to Shankara, only one of the four yogas is a direct path to liberation. And that is, of course, Jnana Yoga. So what was the view of Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda? Sri Ramakrishna famously taught that Bhakti Yoga is as capable of taking us to the highest goal as Jnana Yoga. Sometimes he even kind of reverses Shankara and seems to say that Bhakti is an even greater achievement or attainment. He says things like, Bhakti is like a woman. You can go into the inner chambers of a house, whereas Jnanis can only have to remain on the outside, you know? That means somehow he's hinting that in the highest reaches of Bhakti, you get a more intimate acquaintance with God than you do through the path of Jnana. So if anything, he puts Bhakti on a higher footing than Jnana. But in any case, he generally says that any of these yogas can take you to the same goal, and there's no higher and lower. That's a very important thing about Sri Ramakrishna's teachings. You come away feeling there's no higher and lower, there's no hierarchy. And now let's look briefly at Swami Vivekananda. Let me quote to you a passage from his book. I believe this is from Karma Yoga. He says, each one of our yogas is fitted to make man perfect, even without the help of the others, because they have all the same goal in view. The yogas of work, Karma Yoga, of wisdom, Jnana Yoga, and of devotion, Bhakti Yoga, are all capable of serving as direct and independent means for the attainment of moksha. And you might say he's leaving out the fourth yoga, Raja Yoga, but in his book, Raja Yoga, he explicitly talks about how Raja Yoga is also another equally potent path to the same goal. There's a famous kind of epigraph to Raja Yoga where he says, by one or more of all of these four yogas, by one or more or all, and he includes Raja Yoga there in the form of mysticism, you can attain the same goal. So I think this is a very important difference between Shankara's philosophy and the philosophy of Sri Ramakrishna Swami Vivekananda. In this sense too, it's a much broader philosophy. There's no question of higher and lower, or, Jnanis looking down on bhaktas or bhaktas looking down on Jnanis. These debates have been going on for centuries, and I think people are tired of them. Shankara's putting Jnana Yoga on a pedestal and saying Bhakti and Karma Yoga are lower. Ramanuja comes along, a great bhakta, Acharya, and he says, no, Bhakti Yoga is the highest yoga. And he puts Jnana Yoga and Karma Yoga on a lower pedestal. Karma Yoga always is kind of like the neglected stepson, the Eric Trump of the family. And so it's almost always lower for all of these acharyas. But Sri Ramakrishna and Swamiji come along and say, forget about this higher and lower nonsense. It's really a matter of temperament. Understand yourself and what makes you tick, and then practice the yoga that best suits your nature. And ideally, try to combine, harmonize the four yogas in your daily lives to the best of your ability. That's the position of Sri Ramakrishna Swami Vivekananda. That makes for an all-rounded integral personality, and it makes for the most rapid spiritual progress. This you don't find until the advent of Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda, this wonderful liberality. And okay, finally, I wanted to talk about Sri Ramakrishna's and Swami Vivekananda's doctrine of the harmony of all the world religions, because so far, the previous doctrine was just about the four yogas. You might think, well, the four yogas are still within a Hindu context. But no, they're even broader than that. They say that every one of the world religions are equally capable of taking us to the highest goal of God realization. Sri Ramakrishna, of course, most people know this, he used to teach Joto Mot, Toto Pot, as many fades, so many paths. My favorite formulation of this idea is Tini Ananto, Poto Ananto. God is infinite, and therefore the paths to God are also infinite. The beauty of this is that he explains why there are infinite paths to God. There are infinite paths leading to the same God because God himself is infinite, or God herself is infinite. God is equally he and she in Hinduism. The other thing to notice is that because Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda have a very expansive conception of God, God is not just nirguna, impersonal. God is not just saguna, personal, but both. God is understood as the impersonal, personal, infinite, divine reality. And because of that, and because they conceive the goal of all religions as the realization of God in some form or aspect, they're able to put theistic and non-theistic religious paths and spiritual philosophies on an equal footing. I'm going to repeat that. Because they understand God in a very expansive way as both personal and impersonal, they are able to put theistic and non-theistic spiritual philosophies on an equal footing. So think about devotional philosophies and religions: Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Vaishnavism within Hinduism, and other bhakti schools within Hinduism. What is the goal for them? The goal is to realize some form of the personal God and reside in heaven with some form of personal God. Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda say, wonderful, that's the goal to you, and there's nothing higher than that. For you, that's the goal, and you can reach it through your particular bhakti path, your devotional path. Because God has a real personal aspect. That's the crucial thing. So their broad harmony of religions is grounded in a very expansive understanding of God as both personal and impersonal. And what about non-theistic paths like Buddhism and Advaita Vedanta? They say, wonderful, those are also equally valid paths, because through those paths, you are going to realize your true nature as non-dual, impersonal, pure consciousness. But they don't put Advaita Vedanta or Buddhism on a higher footing than the devotional schools or vice versa. By contrast, what does Shankara have to say about the world religions? Nothing, because he was writing in the 8th century, and he never talked about, and in general, traditional acharyas in India didn't talk about non-Hindu religions typically. But more recent Advaita Vedantins in the 20th century, I'm thinking of people like Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan, T.M.P. Mahadevan, and others, even Swami Vivekananda can be included. They try to kind of update Shankara's Advaita Vedanta for modern times and show how we can adapt Shankara's Advaita Vedanta in order to harmonize the world religion. But so for instance, how did Radhakrishnan do this? Radhakrishnan would say that the goal of all religions is Advaitic realization. And so Advaita is the highest. And so but then he would say that, but through Christianity, through Islam, through Judaism, through Bhakti schools of Hinduism, you can reach a certain state, but ultimately you have to attain the highest Advaitic realization. So here there's clearly a hierarchy. He's using Advaita to harmonize the world religions, but there's still a kind of hierarchy of higher and lower. Advaita is the highest. Theistic paths are placed on a lower footing. They can take you part of the way, but not all the way. You have to ultimately attain the Advaitic realization. The interesting thing about Swami Vivekananda is that he seemed to have held this view for a brief period of about 9 or 10 months, from mid-1894 to mid-1895. And I discussed this in detail in chapter 3 of my book, Swami Vivekananda's Vedantic Cosmopolitanism. So if you want details, please look at that chapter. But I want to just briefly give you an example of his thinking in this brief period from 1894 to 1895. This is in a letter to one of his disciples. He says, all of religion is contained in the Vedanta. That is, in the 3 stages of the Vedanta philosophy: the Dvaita, dualism; Vishishtadvaita, qualified non-dualism; and Advaita, absolute non-dualism. One comes after the other. These are the 3 stages of spiritual growth in man. Each one is necessary. This is the essential of religion. The Vedanta applied to the various ethnic customs and creeds of India is Hinduism. The first stage, i.e. Dvaita, applied to the ideas of the ethnic groups of Europe is Christianity. As applied to the Semitic groups, Mohammedanism, meaning Islam. The Advaita, as applied in its yoga perception form, meaning Yogachara presumably, is Buddhism, etc. So notice that Swami Vivekananda is lumping all of the theistic religious paths, Christianity, Islam, and then obviously also Judaism and Bhakti schools of Hinduism. He places them at the Dvaita stage, the dualistic stage. At best, they might reach the Vishishtadvaita stage, but he's only willing to accord the highest status to Advaita Vedanta and Buddhism. So there's clearly a hierarchy here. But interestingly and highly significantly, and I think this has been overlooked by all scholars, as far as I'm aware, he moved away from that view starting in mid-1895. If you look carefully, chronologically, if you track the way that his views on the harmony of religions evolved from 1893 to 1901, what you'll find, or what at least I found, is that after mid-1895, he stops harmonizing the world religions on the basis of this hierarchical doctrine of 3 stages of Vedanta. And instead, he harmonizes the world religions on the basis of the 4 yogas. How does he do this? What does that look like? The argument proceeds in 3 steps. The first step: every one of the world religions corresponds to one or more of the 4 yogas. He says this, for instance, in his lecture, his beautiful 1896 lecture on Sri Ramakrishna. He says, a man may be intellectual or devotional or mystic or active. The various religions represent one or the other of these types. Intellectual means Jnana Yoga, devotional Bhakti Yoga, mystic Raja Yoga, active Karma Yoga. Each of the world religions corresponds to one or more of these 4 yogas. First step. Second step in his argument: each of these 4 yogas has each of these 4 yogas is equally capable of taking us to the highest goal of salvation or liberation, God realization. He said it in the passage that I already read, but I'll just repeat it to you just so we're all on the same page. He says, each one of our yogas is fitted to make man perfect, even without the help of the others, because they have all the same goal in view. The yogas of work, of wisdom, and of devotion are all capable of serving as direct and independent means for the attainment of moksha. So he's building a very broad and liberal doctrine of the harmony of religions on the basis of his broad understanding of the four yogas as direct paths to the same goal of God realization. And these two claims logically entail the third claim, which is, since each yoga is equally capable of taking us to salvation, and each of the major world religions corresponds to one or more of these four yogas, therefore, all of these religions have the same capacity to take us to the highest goal. He says this explicitly in that same lecture on Sri Ramakrishna delivered in 1896. He says that each religion has the same saving power as the other. And just before he says it, he says we should avoid the mistake that some people make of being patronizing. He uses the word patronizing, and he says some people have the wonderfully liberal idea, and he's being sarcastic, that our religion is the fulfillment of things. You guys are not wrong, but you're sort of stepping stones on the way to my greatest and highest philosophy. You see, I think that partly he's criticizing his own previous view. As he was reflecting on Sri Ramakrishna's broad teachings about the harmony of religions, he might have said, wait a minute, but this view that I was teaching, that Advaita is the highest and that Bhakti schools are kind of on a lower footing, isn't that patronizing too? So that's why I think, or at least that's part of the reason why he moves away from this Advaitic hierarchical understanding of the harmony of religion and toward this much broader doctrine, which teaches that all religions, whether theistic or non-theistic, are equally capable of taking us to the highest goal of God realization. Now, as I mentioned, I guess I do have about 15 minutes, so I thought I would talk a little bit about Vedantic scriptures in this regard. The question is, how do we, so I've just presented to you the gist of Shankara's Advaita Vedanta and what I take to be the main tenets of the integral Advaita or Vijnana Vedanta of Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda. So some of you might wonder, well, okay, but now we're stuck. Which one should we accept? You know, just because I'm a follower of Sri Ramakrishna, what does that mean? I mean, why should I accept his rather than Shankara's? There are different answers to this question, but one criterion is to what extent is this philosophy grounded in the original Vedantic scriptures? This is a very important question. Do the Upanishads support Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, this exclusive Advaita, or the all-encompassing Advaita of Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda? This is an important question. It's a huge can of worms, and I'm just gonna like open it only to close it in 15 minutes. But in any case, that's better than not opening it at all. I like opening cans of worms. So let me open this one. Let me begin with a provocative statement by Swami Vivekananda himself. He says the following: we must interpret the Vedas in the light of the experience of Sri Ramakrishna. Shankaracharya and all other commentators made the tremendous mistake to think that the whole of the Vedas say only one thing. Therefore, they were guilty of torturing those of the apparently conflicting Vedic texts, which go against their own doctrines, into the meaning of their particular schools. No one can truly understand the Vedas and Vedanta unless one studies them in the light of the utterance of Sri Ramakrishna. This is a very strong statement, one that a lot of our monks wince at because they love Shankara. And in training center in Belumat, all brahmacharis are taught the scriptures, Upanishad, Bhagavad Gita, and Brahma Sutra, using Shankara's commentaries. But Swami Vivekananda said we should not teach the scriptures using Shankara's commentary. He says it explicitly. We should reinterpret them and study them in the light of the life and teachings of Sri Ramakrishna. That work has yet to be done. And he says in another place that we should interpret the Vedantic scriptures, this is a direct quotation, on an independent and better basis than by blindly following the commentary. Okay? So let me just give you a couple tantalizing examples and leave it at that. First, what do the Vedantic scriptures have to say about the nature of ultimate reality? Brihadaranyaka Upanishad 3.4.1 describes Brahman as Atma Sarvantaraha, the Atman, the self with the capital S, which is present in all creatures. So this clearly lends itself to more of a Shankarite interpretation. 3.4.2 from the same Upanishad, Nat drishte drashtaram pashyehe, you cannot see that which is the witness of vision. It's the sakshi, the witness of everything happening in the world. Again, this lends itself to Shankara. So Shankara has no problem. He's having a field day with these mantras in the Upanishad. But shortly thereafter, in 3.7 of the same Upanishad, God is described as the Antaryami, the inner controller, controlling and guiding all creatures from within. Here, it's a little bit trickier because this becomes the personal God, guiding us from within. What does Shankara do? Ultimately, he says that this is from a lower standpoint, from the empirical standpoint. 3.8.9 from the same Brihadanaka Upanishad. Etasya va aksharasya prashasane gargi surya chandramaso vidrito tishtataha. Under the mighty rule of this immutable, O Gargi, the sun and moon are held in their positions. Clearly the personal God ruling this universe. When Shankara is confronted with mantras in the Upanishads describing Brahman as personal, he always invokes this two-standpoint framework. And he says that, yes, that's true from the standpoint of ignorance. And now the question is, do we find evidence in the Upanishads themselves to support this two-tier ontological framework? Is the Upanishad itself saying, hold on, now I'm going to speak from the standpoint of ignorance and teach you about the personal God? I think Swami Vivekananda, when he says that Shankara is guilty of text torturing, will say, no. We don't find the Upanishad saying that from the highest standpoint, Brahman is only impersonal. From a lower standpoint, it's personal. We find the Upanishads equally talking and equally effortlessly talking about the personal God and the impersonal absolute, without any higher and lower, without saying one is real and the other is unreal. Another example, Shvetashvatara Upanishad. This is one of the less studied Upanishads, and I think it's a real tragedy in our tradition that we don't study this Upanishad more carefully. I want to just point to one example from this beautiful Upanishad, 6.11. Eko devaha sarvabhuteshu gudaha sarvavyapi sarvabhutantaratma karmadhyakshaha sarvabhutadivasaha sakshi cheta kevalo nirgunascha. In one mantra, you find a very wide-ranging description of Brahman as nirguna. Literally, the term nirguna is used here, which means attributeless, impersonal. Sakshi, which is as I said, the favorite term of Shankarites for explaining the nature of ultimate reality. It's the witness consciousness. It's there. In the same mantra, in the same breath, this Rishi is talking of Brahman as karmadhyakshaha, the one who sort of oversees our karma and allocates each one of us, the karma due to each of us. Sarvabhutadivasaha, the one who dwells within. Eko devaha, the one God, who is sarvabhuteshu gudaha, who is present in a secret way in all creatures. So again, these are all attributes of the personal God. You cannot oversee karma if you're the Sakshi and if you're impersonal, right? So in the same mantra, the Upanishad is talking about God, Brahman, as both personal and impersonal. And again, the question is there any higher and lower here? Is there any suggestion that the personal God is only exists from the standpoint of ignorance? I would say no. And I think these are places where we can arrive at a better interpretation of the Upanishadic mantras if we take the standpoint of Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda rather than the standpoint of Shankara. Second, regarding the world, what do the Upanishads say about, before that, sorry. If you're curious about the Bhagavad Gita, for instance, Bhagavad Gita is full of descriptions of the impersonal Atman, especially chapter 2, but in many other places as well. I'm sure most of you are familiar with that. But starting with some of the later chapters, especially, chapter 9 and following, chapter 12, the whole chapter is called Bhakti Yoga, all the way up to chapter 18, you get the keynote of the Bhagavad Gita becomes the emphasis on the personal God. And in chapter 15, Krishna describes himself as Purushottama, the supreme person. And he says that I am greater even than the Akshara. And then there's a big question. There's a lot of controversy about what is Akshara there and how can Krishna be greater than the Akshara? Because Akshara usually means the impersonal absolute. And Krishna says, I am both personal and impersonal. And he says it in many places. So that's just to give you an example of Bhagavad Gita as well. It seems to effortlessly talk about Brahman as both personal and impersonal without bringing in higher and lower or the standpoints of ignorance and knowledge. Now, second point, what do the scriptures have to say about this world? It seems to me that what the Upanishads and Bhagavad Gita tell us again and again is that this world itself is none other than Brahman. The names and forms that we see around us are themselves real manifestations of God. Chandogya Upanishad says it very clearly in its famous mantra, Sarvam Kalvidam Brahma. All this indeed is Brahman. Mundaka Upanishad 2.2.11, it's a beautiful passage describing the ecstatic spiritual realization of basically what Sri Ramakrishna called the Vijnani. Brahma Vedam Amritam Purastad, Brahma Paschat, Brahma Dakshina. So I'm not going to repeat the whole Sanskrit, but the idea is this Rishi is saying, Brahman is above me, Brahman is below me, Brahman is to my left, Brahman is to my right, Brahman is to the north, Brahman is to the south. He sees nothing but Brahman. Wherever he looks, he sees nothing but Brahman. This is the Vijnani's realization. What Shankara says is, so Shankara also gives an interpretation of these kinds of passages. For instance, in Brahma Sutra, in his commentary on the Brahma Sutra, he refers to this Chandogya Upanishad passage, Sarvam Kalvidam Brahma. He says, yes, it's true, everything is Brahman. Once you subtract names and forms, take the names and forms away from the world, what's left is Brahman. This is Shankara's interpretation. What Sri Ramakrishna says is, no need to subtract anything. Remember, it's an all-encompassing oneness. That means the names and forms are themselves real manifestations of Brahman. In one place in the gospel, he describes one of his own Vijnana realizations and says, one day I was doing puja in the Kali temple, and suddenly I saw that the puja vessels I was using were themselves divine consciousness. The door sill was divine consciousness. A cat walked into the room. The cat, I saw nothing but divine consciousness. Every single thing I saw, every name and every form was itself divine consciousness. This is a good, I think this is a better way of interpreting and taking at face value these different passages from the Vedantic scriptures. Bhagavad Gita says exactly the same thing in 7.19, chapter 7, shloka 19. Bahunam janmanamante jnanavan mam prapadyate vasudevaha sarvam iti samahatma sudurlabhaha. That great soul, after many, many births, realizes Vasudevaha sarvam. There's nothing but Vasudeva. There's nothing but God. Everywhere I look, I see nothing but God. And finally, regarding spiritual practice, what do these scriptures have to say about spiritual practice, the 4 yogas? Bhagavad Gita, let's just look at one shloka and then I'll wrap it up. Shlokas, I think it's either shloka 4 or shloka 5 of chapter 5 of Bhagavad Gita. It's a famous shloka. Sankhya yogo pratagbalaha pravadanti na panditaha ekamapyasita samyak ubhayor vindate pulam. This is, okay, roughly the translation is, fools alone, idiots say that Sankhya, by which Krishna means Jnana Yoga, the yoga of knowledge, and yoga, which in this context means Karma Yoga. Here, there's no dispute among the commentators. Fools alone say that Jnana Yoga and Karma Yoga are different. A person well established in even one of these attains the common goal of both. And interestingly, Swami Vivekananda quotes this passage, this particular shloka, and says that we learn from this shloka that each one of our yogas, remember that statement I've read twice already, the yogas of work, of wisdom, and of devotion are all capable of serving as direct and independent means for the attainment of moksha. Next sentence, he quotes this shloka from the Bhagavad Gita. He's kind of paving the way for us to interpret the Vedantic scriptures in a new way, in a broader way, without depending on Shankara. Shankara will say, Karma Yoga is also a path, but it's not on the same footing as Jnana Yoga. It's a preparatory discipline to purify our minds. And then we practice Jnana Yoga, which is higher. And then Jnana Yoga alone takes us to liberation. Swamiji says, no, Krishna clearly doesn't say this. Krishna is clearly putting Karma Yoga and Jnana Yoga on an equal footing. And then in later chapters, like in chapter 12, Krishna is putting Bhakti Yoga on an even higher footing than Jnana Yoga, arguably. And at the very least on an equal footing. Okay, so in any case, I hope that gives you, as I said, I just wanted to kind of briefly open the can of worms and then shut it back again. So I'm shutting it again. And let me conclude on this note. So you might wonder, Sri Ramakrishna says, for instance, this is one of his famous teachings that a lot of our monks love to quote. Advaita gyan anchale bede jati tu karo. Hide the non-dual knowledge in the kind of corner of your cloth and do whatever you like. Holy Mother said, Thakur Advaita tomra Advaiti. She's telling one of the monastic disciples in the first generation or second generation. Thakur was Advaita, and you also are all Advaitans. And there's this question, well, so isn't Sri Ramakrishna saying that Shankara's philosophy is the highest? Isn't Holy Mother also saying that Thakur himself was a follower of Shankara? I would say no, because notice the word used is Advaita. And I hope if you take nothing else away from this lecture, I've at least convinced you that Shankara's school of Advaita Vedanta is not the only form of Advaita philosophy. Shankara does not have a monopoly on the term Advaita. And so I would just like to raise the question here. When Sri Ramakrishna says Advaita, Advaita Gyan Anshula Beda Jaki, it's like tie Advaita in the hem of your cloth and then do whatever you like. Maybe he's referring to this all-encompassing Advaita, this Vijnana Vedanta, which he teaches constantly in the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. Maybe when Holy Mother says Thakur was Advaita and you all are Advaita, she is also, did she study Shankara's commentaries? No. Of course, she had realizations of both Jnana and Vijnana, but why should we assume that she stopped at Jnana? Maybe Holy Mother too is referring to Thakur as an integral Advaita, as a Vijnana Vedanta. And we, all of us who follow this great spiritual tradition, this Ramakrishna Vivekananda tradition, when she says you are all Advaitins, I just want to raise the possibility that doesn't mean that we are followers of Shankara's Advaita, but that we are followers of Sri Ramakrishna's integral Advaita and Swami Vivekananda's integral Advaita. Brahma Shakti Satyam, Jagat Satyam. And I don't think it's a coincidence that Swami Turiyanandaji on his deathbed, his final words were Brahma Satyam, Jagat Satyam. Thank you. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Paramastu.